Review Symposium labeling such behavior outrageous and asking how best to shame Salon for so completely abandoning journalistic standards. It was a new low. If a conservative writer had done the same thing to a Democratic candidate, that writer would not only be shunned, he'd need a criminal defense attorney. I believe strongly that this was the moment in which the politics of personal destruction, especially in the age of new media, where the old media were on their way out, took over the business. The New York Times and Time and Newsweek were all finally figuring out that they were clinging to each other in desperation as they plummeted off the financial cliff. Their downfall was the result of their failed business model combined with their failed ideology. But their foot soldiers were now firmly embedded in the new media, where the left's partisan hackery could operate on a whole new front. Drudge had taught them the power of the Internet. Now, with all its collusion and single-minded advocacy intact, the complex was firmly established on this new frontier. It was all about to reach the breaking point with the election of George W. Bush. Chapter 5. The Democrat Media Complex Strikes Back. I had watched Bill Clinton get his hand stuck in the cookie jar, or in a humidor to be more precise, and I had watched the forces of the new media hold him accountable in a way the old media would not. I had also studied the perfection of the politics of personal destruction under the Clintons. In particular, I witnessed a shameless president turning the national tragedy of the Oklahoma City bombing into a political opportunity to attack a personal enemy. Before the real culprit, Timothy McVeigh, was even arraigned, Clinton had blamed talk radio, read Rush Limbaugh, for fomenting the climate that led to this isolated incident. It was disgusting, and it was effective. By 2000, I knew these people inside and out. I knew how they operated all too well. Early in that election cycle, I spoke with John Fund of the Wall Street Journal, sensing that the Clintons had crafted the plan to control the Democratic National Committee by putting lackeys like Terry McAuliffe in charge. Sensing also that they were looking for revenge after the new media had maligned and nearly destroyed the Clinton presidency, I predicted that their strategy would be to isolate someone for destruction as a cautionary tale to conservatives. Clearly targeted were those on the right who had been emboldened by the emergence of talk radio and the Internet as communications tools for the masses. The message sent to the new media conservatives would be clear. You punched us, and we will punch you back twice as hard. George W. Bush, I said to John, is making a huge mistake with his uniter, not a divider line. Using his lieutenant governor, Bob Bullock, a Democrat, as a campaign prop in order to demonstrate his goodwill was a mistake. Establishing the standard that he was the good guy who could work with the other side? A mistake. It's a mistake because they're going to use that uniter, not a divider line as a means to mock him and pillory him, undercut his affability and his frat boy good nature, his charming nickname for everybody in the room style, I told John. They're not going to grant him his legitimacy. They're not going to grant him his humanity. They're going to take his personable friendliness, his biggest skill set, and turn it against him. They're going to try to destroy George W. Bush. We are about to witness one of the greatest assaults on an individual in the history of the country. It started right from the beginning. Even before Bush stepped into office, the left used Florida as its first launching pad. The Gore people picked their targets: Bush, Dick Cheney, Katherine Harris. Mark Fabiani, a Gore advisor, told the New York Times candidly, "We needed an enemy." It was raw hysteria plus total media conformity. It didn't matter that Bush won Florida by every possible count, and it didn't matter that even the New York Times and USA Today and every other major publication ran stories tabulating the uncounted votes and recognizing Bush's victory, on page 16B by and large. What mattered were the front-page stories emphasizing that Gore had won, Bush had stolen the election, and the Supreme Court was in the pocket of the big corporations that wanted their man in the White House. Bumper stickers appeared reading, "Not my president," and "Selected, not elected," and "Don't blame me, I voted for Gore." The academics all rallied around the cause. Princeton University professor Fred Greenstein labeled Bush a cowboy moron who had no basis for governing as a conservative. Bush is very good at claiming victory. He has a Marlboro Man approach to communication. His idea of having a mandate is to say, "I have a mandate." After the Supreme Court rightly ruled that arbitrary ballot counting was unconstitutional, the New York Times put the opening stamp of disapproval on the Bush presidency before it had even begun, holding Bush's feet to the fire on bipartisanship and claiming that Bush would have to abandon his political principles in order to attain legitimacy. To make deals with the Democratic leadership in Washington, the president-elect is going to have to bridge some ideological gaps. But this seems, to us, a time to take Mr. Bush at his harmonious word. A presidency that starts out under a cloud of doubt can transform itself into a success at the vital center of politics, where most Americans would want it to be. As the new president entered the White House without the usual bipartisan grace notes from the losing side, the exiting Clintonistas vandalized many of the offices they were vacating and, in an act of pure spite, removed the W from computer keyboards. Bush, the uniter, refused to pursue the matter. Eventually, of course, Bush would learn too late that magnanimity was not a winning strategy against this crowd. The first 8 months of the Bush presidency were spent by the new media fighting to rebuff liberals of all ilks. Pundits, writers, commentators, all arguing that Bush had stolen the election and that this wasn't a real presidency and that he was just plain stupid. While the Clintons properly fought to lay the predicate that their daughter Chelsea was off limits, John McCain was rightfully chastised for an uncalled-for and cruel joke at Chelsea's expense, the same press immediately targeted the Bush daughters for ridicule. The press pursued Jenna in particular and framed her as a wild party child, and even Hollywood stars Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston took to Rolling Stone magazine to make Jenna the butt of an unfunny joke. The same Larry Flynt, who had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars attempting to tear down Republicans to save Clinton, called Bush the dumbest president we have ever had. Martin Sheen, who many in West Los Angeles thought was the real president because of his role on the West Wing, called Bush a moron. Michael Moore predictably stated, "Once you settle for a Ronald Reagan, then it's easy to settle for a George Bush. Then it's real easy to settle for Bush too. You know, this should be evolution. Instead, it's de-evolution. What's next?" Flynt, Sheen, and Moore never graduated college. Flynt didn't even graduate high school. Bush graduated from Harvard Business School. Maureen Dowd, whose writing can be buoyant and insightful, picked up the "Bush is stupid" mantra in her column immediately after Bush's election. Commenting on President Bush's visit to Yankee Stadium in May 2001, Dowd wrote, "Some days it's fun to be the boy toy of the military-industrial complex. Doesn't W realize that everybody in the world hates us?" Gerhard Schroeder thinks that he and W had no communication when they met, and that W had trouble remembering his name. Tony Blair has to call Bill Clinton to find a sympathetic ear. She accused Bush of trying to turn Alaska into a giant oil rig and give more riches to the rich. She accused him of rewarding his contributors with the Pentagon. There's that bipartisan feeling Bush was talking about. They were well on their way to destroying Bush. Then 9/11 happened. September 11th obviously changed everything. It stopped the left from bleeding the country dry with its cynical partisanship veiled as objective and neutral coverage and commentary. The liberal model of separating Americans into different categories as a means toward empowering group leaders to tell their followers what to think, what to believe, and how to fight everyone else was over. They couldn't pit Americans against each other anymore, and that scared the hell out of them, because that was how they'd gotten themselves elected for decades. September 11th took the pendulum and swung it away from polarization and toward unity. It brought America back to its natural state of e pluribus unum, for a very short time, a time in which even Democrats were awkwardly forced to hold hands with Republicans and sing, "God Bless America." Nothing was clearer to me at that time than the artificiality of the feeling, the fact that Democrats were caught in an unpredictable moment in which their tactics for gaining and holding power and manipulating situations were frozen solid. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to handle things, because it had been a lifetime since the honest Democratic Party was taken over by the far-left operatives. Into that void stepped George W. Bush. He acted as a real leader, and he brought the country back together. He was no nonsense, and he wasn't the cowboy the complex had made him out to be. "When I take action," he said on September 13th, 2001, "I'm not going to fire a $2 million missile at a $10 empty tent and hit a camel in the butt. It's going to be decisive." When he spoke on September 20th, 2001, the Democratic angst was already evident that this president had beaten their politics of personal destruction. "Tonight, we are a country awakened to danger and called to defend freedom," Bush said. "Our grief has turned to anger and anger to resolution. Whether we bring our enemies to justice or bring justice to our enemies, justice will be done." And as Bush spoke, the camera panned to Senator Hillary Clinton, a woman President Bush had greeted with a warm hug in the Oval Office just a week before after the attacks, and Hillary was sitting there and her arms were folded tightly. It was such a telling moment, because Hillary isn't like Bill, with his shit-eating grin, his good old boy charm. She's a bad actor. And you could tell right away that her well-funded, well-oiled, John Podesta-led machinery was of no use to her at a moment when Americans were connected like never before, when wedges were blunted and impotent. The Democratic Party, which had put on a face of TLC moderation during the Clinton years, which had been headed up by the greatest triangulator and faux moderate in American history, had painted itself into a corner. It was one thing for Americans to embrace the soft socialism of the Democratic Party and their hatred for the American military when we were in the context of a peace dividend, when foreign policy was considered of secondary importance. It was okay during the 1990s that the Democratic Party had an obvious disposition against a strong foreign policy, and that, but for Joe Lieberman and a very few others, the people in the Democratic leadership were primarily motivated by concerns of social justice and economic equality, socialism in everything but name, and that they wanted to decrease funding for the military because they were naive doves. But when 9/11 happened, the Democratic Party's position became untenable. It granted the Republican Party a default dominant position in perpetuity if national security and terrorism were going to be the top story of our time. So for a time, the Democrats stayed silent. In fact, just for show, they rallied around Bush. The New York Times reported, "Many Democrats who once dismissed Mr. Bush as too naive and too dependent on advisers to steer the United States through an international crisis are now praising him and his advisers' performance. Some are even privately expressing satisfaction that Mr. Gore, who tried to make his foreign affairs expertise an issue in the campaign, did not win." That created an obvious vacuum for the left. The Democrats were too busy pretending to like Bush and a strong America to soldier on. The vacuum was filled by the extreme left, which would include groups like MoveOn.org and ascendant left-wing group blog The Daily Kos. I witnessed that process beginning to take shape around September 20th at the Los Angeles Federal Building, which is just south of my house. I walked down there with my family, and I saw all of the placards that 4 years later became mainstream slogans, pushing the politics of personal destruction against George W. Bush. These were radical leftist movement people aligned with Marxist pro-Stalinist organizations like International Answer, whose anti-war marches were unchallenged by a pliant media. Why the pass, when it was clear that if the KKK had organized an anti-war rally, there would have been major media blowback? I remember looking at Susie and saying, This is going to be the resurgence of the professoriate and the baby boomer left. This is what they've been waiting for. This is going to be their last stand to fulfill their self-appointed 60s revolutionary mission. They had been gathering. They had maintained their existence within the protective walls of college campuses. Their gray ponytails got more gray as time went on, but they never shed their belief systems. If you walked through the hallways of UCLA and looked at the professors' and lecturers' doors, you would have known they were still true believers in the 1960s world and that they had allies in positions of power in unions all over the country and in Hollywood. These were people who had never met an anti-war storyline they didn't love. An alliance of pre-existing, seemingly marginal left-of-center remnants of a bygone era simply walked through the front door and took over the Democratic Party. The marginal political world of the alt weeklies that I used to read had taken center stage. And I knew the tactics they were going to use. The media. They were going to aim the pop culture at selected MTV youth, Abercrombie and Fitch youth, brandishing anti-war bumper stickers and T-shirts. They were going to imitate the means and methods of the 60s. They were going to use their propaganda techniques, their stronghold in popular culture. Hollywood led the way. That was a natural. They did it with a two-pronged strategy. They lampooned Bush, and they accused the right of attempting to silence them. This while they wouldn't shut up about their supposed lack of free speech. Celebrities spoke first, because when 9/11 temporarily distracted us from our pop-cultural obsession, they, narcissists that they are, demanded the limelight back, and anti-Americanism and left-wing sloganeering became their de facto script for the Bush years. Hollywood is a leftist colony. It was easy for Hollywood people to be the first brave voices to say politically unpopular things on soapboxes because their jobs were protected, because their bosses believed what they believed in. After 1972, in which Richard Nixon won and George McGovern lost, a fact Hollywood never really accepted, the late New Yorker columnist Pauline Kael said she couldn't believe Nixon had won since everyone she knew had voted for McGovern. America sent a message to the left. We're not interested. So Hollywood decided to send a message to the country. The natural aging process was culling out patriotic Hollywood, with John Wayne and Gary Cooper dying and Jimmy Stewart coming to the end of his career, and the paradigms of the Western and the pro-war movies were giving way to the anti-Vietnam consensus. The counterculture took a foothold in the 60s in Hollywood, with the radical leftists inside the business taking over completely. They didn't just take over the business, they took over the art, infusing movies and television with anti-heroes instead of heroes, Easy Rider instead of Casablanca, Midnight Cowboy instead of The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Growing up in Hollywood, going to school there where my administrators invited Tom Hayden to come speak without the slightest concern that many in the country considered him a traitor for legitimate reasons, I knew these people. They were my friends' parents, who voted for Hayden even though they owned million-dollar houses. These people, who hung out with the richest of the rich, gave license to their sense of entitlement and noblesse oblige by hanging out with political radicals while simultaneously wearing the outfits and haircuts of conformists. They started to sneak into traditional society pretending they were something they weren't. Tom Wolfe famously wrote about this elitist poserism in Radical Chic and Mau-Mauing the Flack Catchers, which, if you haven't read it, is a must. They were the first to start raising the anti-Bush flag once more. This was long before the Iraq War. They were concerned first and foremost with tearing down this rube, this symbol of American exceptionalism and unity. The Iraq invasion took place in March 2003. In February 2002, just months after September 11th, Bush's approval rating was still around 80% at this point. TV's fake president Martin Sheen said, "George W. Bush is like a bad comic working the crowd, a moron, if you'll pardon the expression." George Clooney said in January 2003, "The Bush administration is run exactly like The Sopranos." Dustin Hoffman injected conspiracy theory leftism in February 2003. I believe that the administration has taken the events of 9/11 and has manipulated the grief of the country, and I think that's reprehensible. Robert Redford said something similar in December 2002. Coyote? The group of them, a pack of coyotes, tricky, cunning, making sure to take care of themselves, but doing it in a wily way, making sure they never get caught. Jessica Lange said in October 2002, while accepting a film award, I hate Bush. I despise him and his entire administration. It makes me feel ashamed to come from the United States. It is humiliating. Ed Harris went after Bush with a hammer and tongs. Being a man, I've got to say that we got this guy in the White House who thinks he is a man, who projects himself as a man because he has a certain masculinity. He's a good old boy. He used to drink, and he knows how to shoot a gun and how to drive a pickup truck. That is not the definition of a man. Even as they pushed their hatred of Bush as fully legitimate and praiseworthy, the press did nothing. Actually, the press did worse than nothing. They gave them a microphone to distribute their views unchallenged. Susan Sarandon appeared on CBS's The Early Show and Face the Nation. Madonna appeared on Dateline NBC. Harry Belafonte appeared on Larry King Live, as did Sean Penn. Mike Farrell appeared on NBC's Meet the Press. As Laura Ingraham writes in her book, Shut Up and Sing, whenever a top entertainer has a political bone to pick, he or she has an instant platform. Hollywood dragged out its oldest lefties and its youngest lefties. Jan Wenner, a baby boomer who still force-feeds the relevance of Bruce Springsteen with repetitive front-page power picks, used this movement to promote Green Day and any other pop cultural vessel that would create anti-war albums. MTV found selective youth, sexy youth, wearing anti-war t-shirts and put them on TV every night. There was an urge in Hollywood from the old and the young to affirm the baby boomer boss lovers' yearnings for the age of Aquarius to be reborn in the Bush age. These were the loudest people in the world, and the press was giving them free rein to say and do whatever they wanted, to incite political stunts reminiscent of the merry pranksters, to use media trickery to make points, to spawn a youth rebellion against the President of the United States during wartime. They were representing America abroad, and they were representing us as evil hayseeds bent on killing brown people, and the media were abetting this slander. Next, Hollywood engaged in a ploy designed to paint the Bush administration with the tar of fascism. They accused Bush and conservatives of shutting down their free speech. The juxtaposition was astonishing. The false accusations that conservatives and Republicans were telling the left to shut up, alongside the simple fact that every burp these bratty windbags uttered during this period was printed and reprinted ad nauseum. But by accusing conservatives of McCarthyism and raising that bugaboo, they wanted to do just what they falsely accused conservatives of doing. They wanted to shut them up. As part of this, they crafted a dissent is patriotic meme, an absurd slogan to begin with that they intentionally misattributed to patriotic founding fathers like Benjamin Franklin. They would later be forced to attribute it to pseudo-scholar Howard Zinn. Deconstructed, dissent is patriotic is a self-negating slogan because its validity clearly depends on what kind of dissent you're talking about. If you're a member of the neo-Nazis in America, you're dissenting, but nobody would call that dissent patriotic. But if you're anti-war, dissent is automatically patriotic, according to David Geffen's guest list, even if you're a member of Al-Qaeda, presumably, since they are anti-war, at least as far as the United States goes. The aphorism is nonsensical, but the left repeated it so many times and so often that it lost all meaning. They slapped it on every bumper sticker, on every Prius at every Whole Foods, and it worked. Next, they accused conservatives of quashing this dissent. They framed their arguments as though they were victims, even while saying things that were outrageous and arguably un-American. Susan Sarandon said, "It's terrifying to me to feel the fear that exists now in the United States, to even question anything for fear of being labeled anti-American." The early signs are this administration could go further, shutting down information, not allowing certain truths to get out, said Robert Redford in January 2003. And all you've got to do is look at history to see what that led to. The McCarthy era. In April 2003, Tim Robbins, Sarandon's former quasi-common-law husband and possibly potential co-recipient of her Social Security check, famously warned of a chill wind blowing in America. Where did he say that? At the National Press Club, of course, on national television as broadcast by C-SPAN. Why Robbins would be at the National Press Club to begin with is a question that, if you've made it this far in the audiobook, I suspect you can reason out. Robbins started off by telling the assembled media sycophants that after 9/11 he was ready for unity. What kind of unity? A unity where President Bush would use the momentum from 9/11 not to defend America, but to help people at community centers to tutor children, to teach them to read, at old age homes to visit the lonely and infirm, convert abandoned lots to baseball fields. Robbins's kind of unity would send a message to terrorists everywhere. If you attack us, we will become stronger, cleaner, better educated, and more unified. Yeah, Tim, extending Head Start and giving funds to the local YMCA would have Osama bin Laden quaking in his sandals. That unity didn't materialize, and Robbins knew it would never materialize because nobody would seriously think that the Bush administration would fight terror with increased welfare payments. So Robbins turned against Bush. In the 19 months since 9/11, we have seen our democracy compromised by fear and hatred. Basic inalienable rights, due process, the sanctity of the home have been quickly compromised in a climate of fear. The only climate of fear was the one Robbins was generating, of course, but this new climate of fear allowed Robbins to pretend to be a victim. A message is being sent through the White House and its allies in talk radio and clear channel communications. If you oppose this administration, there can and will be ramifications. Every day the airwaves are filled with warnings, veiled and unveiled threats, spewed invective and hatred directed at any voice of dissent. Robbins wasn't the only one pursuing this line of thought. The Dixie Chicks bashed Bush overseas and then complained about it on Larry King Live when people reacted with outrage, with Natalie Maines explaining, "I feel patriotic and strong. We will continue to be who we are." Sean Penn took out a full-page ad in the Washington Post in 2002, well before the Iraq War, in which he ripped President Bush for violating every defining principle of this country over which you preside. Intolerance of debate, with us or against us, marginalization of your critics, the promoting of fear through unsubstantiated rhetoric, manipulation of a quick comfort media. Yes, Penn was a victim who could afford to take out a $56,000 ad in one of the nation's leading newspapers. The best part of his ad was his suggestion that Bush listen to Gershwin in order to avoid war. Which Gershwin, exactly? Porgy and Bess, or perhaps An American in Paris? Even as the Hollywood left played the victim game, they shut down members of their own community or their perceived community who disagreed with them. This is a town, after all, that boasts about Janine Garofalo, who preaches, "Our country is founded on a sham. Our forefathers were slave-owning rich white guys who wanted it their way. So when I see the American flag, I go, oh my God, you're insulting me. That you can have a gay parade on Christopher Street in New York with naked men and women on a float cheering, 'We're here, we're queer,' that's what makes my heart swell. Not the flag, but a gay naked man or woman burning the flag. I get choked up with pride." It's no wonder that conservatives in Hollywood are treated as though they suffer from highly contagious leprosy, and during the Bush years, that only escalated. They pumped out anti-war dud after anti-war dud, and they cast out every right-winger vengefully, or at least every right-winger they could find. But the phenomenon wasn't limited to Hollywood. It was a pattern that pervaded the left. If you offended the prevailing sensibilities of your group, you were made to pay. Joe Lieberman was a living example. He was savaged for dissenting on one issue at a time when dissent was supposedly patriotic, and at the same time the left was claiming false victimhood. The left painted Lieberman as the conscience of the Senate when he ran